Ed Sullivan stood in the lobby of Studio 50, watching Duke Ellington walk through the front entrance with his entire orchestra, and Ed's face had gone from its usual pale color to something approaching panic. It was March 1952, and Duke Ellington was arriving for his first Ed Sullivan Show appearance. But Duke wasn't arriving the way Ed had specified in the memo sent to his management. Duke wasn't using the service entrance. He wasn't coming in through the loading dock. He was walking through the front doors of Studio 50, like he owned the building. His orchestra behind him, all of them black men in immaculate suits, carrying their instruments with the quiet dignity of people who refuse to be made invisible. Ed's stage manager rushed over, his voice low and urgent. "Ed, what do we do?" The memo clearly said they should use the service entrance. Having them come through the front, the other performers, the crew, it's going to cause problems. Ed looked at Duke Ellington, who was now standing in the middle of the lobby, waiting patiently for someone to acknowledge him. And Ed understood in that moment that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. Duke Ellington had read the memo about using the service entrance and had made a deliberate choice to ignore it. And now Ed had to decide whether to enforce a policy that he'd never had to defend out loud, or to let it go and hope nobody noticed. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness is the moment when one of the greatest musicians in American history looked at the most powerful man in television and said, "I will not be made to feel lesser than anyone else in this building." To understand why Duke Ellington using the front entrance was such a crisis for Ed Sullivan, you need to understand what Studio 50 was like in 1952. The building itself had no official segregation policies, but it had unwritten rules that everyone understood and followed. Black performers used the service entrance. They used separate dressing rooms in the basement. They didn't mingle with white performers in common areas. These weren't laws. They were customs. And customs in 1952 were often more powerful than laws. Ed Sullivan had grown up in a segregated America, and had built his show in a segregated industry. He'd fought against some of that segregation, booking black performers when other shows wouldn't, giving them airtime when other producers were too cowardly. But Ed had always operated within the system, pushing boundaries gently, never breaking them outright. He'd told himself that incremental progress was better than no progress, that getting black performers on television at all was victory enough. Duke Ellington saw things differently. By 1952, Duke was 53 years old and had been fighting against racism with quiet dignity for his entire career. He'd played in segregated venues across the South where he had to enter through back doors, through loading docks, through entrances marked colored only, while white audiences walked through marble lobbies to their seats. He'd stayed in hotels that made him and his orchestra use service elevators so white guests wouldn't have to share an elevator with black people. He'd eaten in restaurants that served him in kitchens instead of dining rooms, where he could cook his own food but couldn't sit where white patrons could see him. And somewhere in those decades of humiliation, Duke had made a decision that would define the rest of his life and career. He would no longer cooperate with his own degradation. He would perform his music at the highest level, demand respect equal to his talent, and refuse to accept any arrangement that treated him as less than fully human. If that meant losing opportunities, so be it. Duke had learned that opportunities that required you to degrade yourself weren't really opportunities at all. When Duke's management had received Ed's memo specifying that Mr. Ellington and his orchestra should use the service entrance to avoid congestion in the main lobby, Duke had read it and understood immediately what those words actually meant. It wasn't about congestion. Madison Square Garden handled larger crowds than Studio 50 without requiring anyone to use service entrances. Carnegie Hall managed just fine. This was about maintaining the unwritten hierarchy that said black artists, no matter how talented, no matter how famous, belonged in the back and the basement, not in the front and the spotlight where they might be seen as equals to white performers. Duke had called his manager. "Tell Mr. Sullivan that my orchestra and I will be using the front entrance. If that's a problem for him, we won't be appearing on his show." The manager had tried to convince Duke to compromise. "Duke, it's the Ed Sullivan Show. It's the biggest platform in television. Is the front entrance really worth fighting over?" Duke's response had been quiet but absolute. "It's not about the entrance. It's about what the entrance represents. If I accept being sent to the back door, I'm accepting that I'm less than the white performers who use the front door. I'm not less than anyone. My musicians aren't less than anyone. We'll use the front entrance or we won't appear. The manager had called Ed's office with Duke's position. Ed's response had been frustrated. This is about logistics, not race. The front entrance gets crowded. The service entrance makes more sense for large groups. But Duke's manager had pressed. Ed, Duke uses front entrances at concert halls across the country. This is about respect, and Duke won't compromise on it. Ed had been annoyed, but had assumed Duke would ultimately see reason. Surely Duke understood how things worked. Surely he'd comply when he actually arrived at the studio. But now Duke was standing in the lobby with his entire orchestra, having used the front entrance deliberately, and Ed had to make a decision. Ed walked over to Duke, his face carefully neutral, aware that every eye in the lobby was on them. Mr. Ellington, there seems to have been some confusion about which entrance to use. The memo we sent specified. Duke looked at Ed with eyes that were calm but absolutely uncompromising. There was no anger there, no defensiveness, just a quiet certainty that was somehow more intimidating than rage would have been. There's no confusion, Mr. Sullivan. My orchestra and I are professionals. Professional musicians use front entrances at concert halls, at recording studios, at every venue where we perform. That's standard practice. We see no reason why your studio should be different. The memo specified the service entrance for logistical reasons. Ed tried again, knowing even as he said it how weak the excuse sounded. Large groups, equipment. It makes more sense, Mr. Sullivan. Duke interrupted gently, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire lobby. I've traveled with this orchestra to venues across the world. We've performed at Royal Albert Hall in London. We've played at the Paris Opera. We've appeared at concert halls that make this studio look small. And somehow, mysteriously, none of those venues have ever found it necessary to direct us to service entrances. Somehow they all manage to accommodate our large groups through their front doors. Ed felt sweat forming on his forehead. Other performers were watching. Crew members had stopped what they were doing. Everyone in the lobby was witnessing this conversation. And Ed knew that whatever happened next would be repeated in every dressing room, every bar, every place where entertainment industry people gathered. Mr. Ellington, I've put more black performers on television than anyone else in this industry. Ed said, his voice dropping lower, trying to make this a private conversation in a very public space. I've fought for you and artists like you when other producers wouldn't touch you. I've taken risks, and this is how you repay that. By creating a scene in my lobby over which door you walked through. Duke's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate that you've given black performers opportunities to appear on your show. But let me be very clear about something. Opportunities given on the condition that we accept our own degradation, that we smile and use the back entrance, and pretend we're not being treated as lesser. Those aren't really opportunities. They're just a gentler, more polite form of the same discrimination. They're just bigotry with better manners. I won't use the back entrance. If that means I can't perform on your show, I can live with that. Can you live with explaining to America why Duke Ellington's orchestra wasn't on your show tonight? Ed stared at Duke, understanding that he'd lost this battle before it had even begun. Duke Ellington was too famous, too respected, too important to simply dismiss. And if word got out that Ed had canceled Duke for using the front entrance, Ed would look like exactly what he'd always claimed he wasn't, just another white man enforcing segregation. Fine, Ed said quietly, use whatever entrance you want. But we're going to have a conversation about this later. Duke smiled slightly. I look forward to it, Mr. Sullivan. The performance that night was magnificent. Duke Ellington and his orchestra played with the precision and soul that had made them legends. The studio audience, integrated in a way that was still unusual for television in 1952, responded with thunderous applause. And Ed watched from the wings, realizing that Duke had been right. This orchestra, these musicians, they belonged on the biggest stage in America, entering through the front door like the royalty they were. After the show, Ed did have that promised conversation with Duke. In Ed's office, with the door closed, Ed tried one more time to explain his position. Duke, you have to understand the pressure I'm under. Sponsors, affiliates, they expect certain things. If I start letting every black performer use the front entrance, march through the lobby like they own the place, I'm going to get complaints. Duke leaned back in his chair. Ed, let me tell you something. Every time a black person accepts being sent to the back door, we make it easier for the next black person to be sent there too. And every time a black person refuses, we make it harder to send anyone else there. I refuse today, and you let me refuse. That means the next black performer who wants to use your front entrance has a precedent. You've already allowed it once. It'll be harder to deny it again. Ed understood what Duke was saying. This hadn't been about one entrance on one day. This had been Duke Ellington setting a new standard, changing the rules, using his leverage to force progress that Ed had been too comfortable to push for himself. You used me, Ed said, not quite angry, but not quite accepting either. I used your platform, Duke corrected. Just like you've used my talent. The difference is I used it to make things better for people who come after me. What did you use it for? The question hung in the air between them. Ed had no good answer. Over the following months and years, other black performers started using the front entrance at Studio 50. Some asked permission. Some, following Duke's example, simply walked through and dared anyone to stop them. And gradually, quietly, the unwritten rule about service entrances disappeared. Not because Ed Sullivan had decided to change it, but because Duke Ellington had decided it was already changed. Duke Ellington appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show multiple times over the next 2 decades. Each time he used the front entrance. Each time his musicians were treated with the same respect as white performers. And each time, Ed was reminded of the day Duke had forced him to choose between his comfort and his principles. In 1974, shortly before Ed Sullivan died, he gave an interview where he was asked about his legacy regarding race and television. I put more black performers on television than anyone else in my era, Ed said. I fought battles with sponsors and affiliates to make that happen. But I'll tell you something I learned from Duke Ellington. Fighting battles isn't enough. You have to be willing to lose things to win them. Duke was willing to lose my show to win the right to use the front door. I wasn't willing to lose anything. I wanted progress without cost. And Duke taught me that progress always costs something. Duke Ellington died in May 1974, just weeks after Ed. At Duke's funeral, musicians and dignitaries spoke about his contributions to jazz, to American music, to culture. But several speakers also mentioned smaller victories, like the day Duke Ellington walked through the front entrance of a television studio and refused to be sent to the back. Billy Strayhorn, Duke's longtime collaborator, said it best. Duke understood that dignity isn't negotiable. You don't ask for it. You don't accept substitutes for it. You simply refuse to proceed without it. And if that means you don't proceed, well, that's the price of dignity. But Duke knew that powerful people don't respect you for accepting less than you deserve. They respect you for demanding what you deserve and refusing to move until you get it. The front entrance of the Ed Sullivan Theater still stands today. Thousands of performers have walked through it over the decades since Duke Ellington insisted on using it. Most of them never knew there was a time when some people were expected to use a different entrance. Most of them never knew that Duke Ellington changed that with a single act of dignified defiance. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Duke Ellington refused to use the back entrance, and in doing so opened the front entrance for everyone who came after him. Have you ever refused to accept less than you deserved, even when refusing cost you something? Share your story in the comments below.